Thank you so much. And thanks, Sean. Thank you very much to Mark and Mel as well, who beautifully segued into the kind of stuff that we're going to be doing here. As Sean just told us, we are looking at the changing game of sports media, but in keeping with the room, in keeping with the vibe, we are going to touch on something that appeals to just about everybody here today. Now, as you can see, we've got Vicky here, we've got Kelly here, and you've heard their titles. You're going to hear about what they're going to bring to this in just a moment, but let's just lay out what we're doing here. So it's a timely panel, this one, because we've all known how vastly and how quickly the way audiences consume, watch, engage with sport has changed over the last 5 years, over the last year, over the last 5 months even. Streaming, OTT, social media, direct-to-consumer platforms, that's just in terms of watching. But what about the way that leagues, brands, and anyone involved in sport, including talent, engages with fans? We're going to explore that here. It's a simple concept in some ways, but we're going to touch upon something, as I said, that will relate to everybody out there. Let's explain what everyone's going to bring to this one. We have two different panelists with different but very complementary perspectives here. Let's talk about Kelly. She's spent her career at the cutting edge, of course, of sports media and entertainment, Viacom, ESPN, Disney, the NBA. She knows the distribution side of things inside out, launching platforms, negotiating deals, tailoring content. And then, of course, now with the NBA, she can tell us how a global league can reach out to fans, can broadcast, can communicate with fans, but also remain relevant in a local context. Vicky, meanwhile, as you've heard already from her title, she leads Wasserman's business across Asia here, sitting at the intersection, just like All That Matters does, of sport, music, entertainment, gaming, and much more. She's seeing firsthand, for example, how athletes are turning into content creators, how brands are looking to inspire fans in what can be an increasingly fragmented space. So between them, we've got the journey covered. And the good news is I'm going to stop talking right now and ask them a question and get this thing up and running. So let's start off with the big picture, guys. And I think because we've set ourselves such a broad and vast-ranging brief here, let's ask you this. We're in a world where all of the things I've laid out before, OTT, social platforms, direct-to-consumer, have reshaped how sport is consumed. The choices for fans are even greater than they've ever been. But what I want is a personal or professional perspective. Kelly and Vicky, to start off with, give us an example of how this explosion of distribution, channels and otherwise, has changed the game or sport for you in recent years. Kelly?
I think, when I was born back in the dark ages, John, there was only one way that you really consumed sport, and that was kind of because, you watched with your grandparents, you watched with your parents, you watched all together, gathered around one TV that was largely streaming a free-to-air sponsored broadcast into the living room. And so we're at this tipping point now, this proliferation of devices and ways that fans can touch sport or touch a league like the NBA. And really, there's this whole there are hundreds of different entry points into sport now, whether that's for the NBA, you could be a big sneakerhead, or you could be a gamer, you could be a fan of the pop group, K-pop group in Hyphen. There are multiple different ways that you could enter into a doorway and sort of experience the NBA. And I think that's really the biggest difference of where we are now, irrespective of the changes that are happening with platforms themselves.
Okay, so that's your personal and very professional perspective. Vicky, what about you? Any anecdotal evidence of the way things have changed in your career recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that you say 5 years, because I'm coming up to 5 years in Asia now, having previously lived in a few different places in Europe. So from a personal perspective, that was a very different shift in the way that I would consume sports content when I came into this continent. And actually, typically, those forms of content that I would consume when I was in Europe, I couldn't do that when I was here. Different time zone, right? Very different sports that we're watching as well. So, I mean, just personally, I've become a fan of many different sports since I've been out here, which I love. I'm consuming them in very different ways. And the sports that I might have been consuming, a mega fan of soccer, football, back in Europe, rather than actually watching those games live now, I listen to podcasts. You know, I get my fix through that, which I never would have thought of doing, 5 years ago. But actually, that works for me. It works on my time zone. I still get my fix. I get to play fantasy football. And I'm consuming in very different ways. So I'm also conscious that, I am not Gen Z, right? So personally, I'm not consuming through TikTok, but I am absolutely the minority in that sense. So I think Kelly is so right. Just the number of different ways in now, and actually how that is creating new fans, right, who are coming into sport is it's very exciting.
I love the fact that, we've already touched on sneakers as a way into sport. We've spoken about podcasts, and I'd like to hope that everybody who's with us here in this room and watching elsewhere will have started thinking already about, how do I engage with sport? How do I, for example, apart from watching Ryder Cup the other night, I watch far more golf via YouTubers playing with or against professionals than I do actually watching organized golf tournaments on TV right now. So I think we're all changing, as you said, in the way that we consume sport. And I want to come back to that later on. We're going to talk about this intersection we find ourselves at between so many different aspects of culture that have a commonality in sport. But I'd like to just focus a bit more broadly on the NBA as a great case study here for my next topic here. And this is when you have a sporting league, an entity which has more than half its fans outside of the country where it's played, in that case, the USA, how do you think globally, but also stay true to the product in terms of its domestic origins? What lessons do we take, or should we take, from the NBA's international broadcast and streaming footprint in terms of striking that balance between local relevance and a global popularity of the product?
So the NBA is super unique, I think, as an American and having a point of view on sort of American sports leagues. I think, the NBA is really not an American league anymore. It's a global league. We have about 450 players, 125 of whom last season were from outside the U.S., which really makes it one of the more global sports leagues, I think, in the world. And that is both an opportunity and a challenge. I think we have an enormous opportunity across Asia to figure out different ways to serve fans locally, whether that's through local players. So we are blessed with a couple local players of note in markets like Japan. I'm going to Melbourne tomorrow to watch the Pelicans, the NBA's Pelicans team, play the NBL in Australia, where I believe there will be 17 Australians playing in the NBA this coming season. So, one of the ways that we sort of serve local fans is by having local players and having that connectivity and that sort of local aspirational connection to local players. I think another way is obviously localizing the content itself through language localization or the localization of our services. And then the third is kind of, both one of our biggest challenges and opportunities, which I think is ultimately our games, as global as we are, our games are played back in the US for the most part. So, how do we kind of bring that experience closer to fans where they actually are? And part of that is through bigger events like the one that I'm going to this weekend in Melbourne, or next weekend in Macau, where we have the Nets playing the Suns. Another way is to start developing more local events here in Asia where we can reach more local fans. So I'd say an example of that is last summer we kicked off our Rising Stars Invitational Tournament where we had 10 countries of high school age students come here to Singapore and compete against each other. The Japanese girls won, the Korean boys won. It brought the sport closer to the kids. It made it more sort of, I think, like not just aspirational, but something that they could reach and touch of the brand that was actually in their own backyard.
I love that. I love the fact that it was done at a scale that worked, because sometimes, and I speak from my experience with the Premier League, when you would come to Asia and you'd bring Premier League clubs, but there'd be a huge disconnect between what they did and what might happen in the local ecosystem. But you seem to have found the right way for different markets of doing that. Vicky, just if you want to come in here, because before we get too far along, you spoke, Kelly, about if there are local athletes in your league, engaging with that. And we see that with football, but we haven't had that many Asian players in the Premier League, for example. So when you do, particularly if it's a Japanese player, you have just wall-to-wall coverage, non-stop coverage of that player in that particular market. We've seen it with Song Heung-min in particular, with the Koreans. But from the athletes and from the brand's perspective, how do you address that business of localizing an overseas product?
Totally. Well, first, before I get to that, I just wanted to touch on Rising Stars Invitational, because I actually got to go to that. And I've got to say, that was such an inspirational event. And we loved, as an agency, that the first place that actually the NBA ever put that on was in Asia. And as an agency, with many of the brands we're working with here, we're working across 18 different markets in Asia, and it's difficult to serve those markets. And so what we loved about RSI, the Rising Stars Invitational, was the opportunity to really genuinely connect with people in 10 different markets, and with the youth, with these rising stars, which just brings a completely different perspective to what we're doing in terms of how we are connecting with fans and how we are connecting brands into those properties as well. So I think we need more of that, honestly. I think that's actually like genuine innovation that the NBA have brought to Asia, and I think there's a huge opportunity for more content like that in this region. But from a talent perspective, yeah, absolutely. We represent a lot of players, a lot of NBA players, a lot of WNBA players at Wasserman. A great example, I think, is with Rui. So Rui Hachimura plays for the Lakers. For anyone that doesn't know, John told me some people might not know, but I don't know. Great guy, and he's from Japan. He's such an authentic guy. Very. He really genuinely wants to give back. He really genuinely wants to sort of grow the game throughout Japan, but also throughout Asia. So we worked with him this year to create the Black Samurai series, which was a 4-day series where he was on the ground in Japan, in Nagoya. We had over 3,000 kids who applied to be part of his camp that he was putting on, basically, in Nagoya. We whittled that down to 150 kids. And we brought them all together. It was a 4-day program of sort of coaching the coaches, coaching these kids, and bringing them together at the end for basically like an all-star game, effectively, where then we had like 10,000 like fans, members of the public who came in and watched these games that were kind of curated by Rui himself. And he was there and he was sort of congratulating the kids. And what an amazing way when you can't always bring games to the region. And actually, I think the NBA is very good at doing that. Lucky enough to be coming to Macau next week. But what an amazing way for athletes to really genuinely and authentically connect with their fans on the ground throughout the world. It's actually, pretty simple model, but it means so much, right? And from a media perspective, actually that was just huge in terms of the impressions that we got for that event.
You mentioned the Pelicans game. I'd imagine that'd be quite a competitive one, because sometimes what you have is a huge disconnect, Kelly, between the quality of the play in your league and what they'll come up against elsewhere. I mean, we're not quite talking Harlem Globetrotters, but it's, there is that sort of distance. But that, in Australia, you'll have a good game, won't you?
I would just point out the Harlem Globetrotters are a highly skilled group of people. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been to my fair share of like football-friendly matches in the region, where it definitely feels sometimes like, the teams are kind of showing up and not exactly, putting their best effort in. I do think one of the things that's unique about what we're doing in Australia this weekend is it's a club game, which for us means we have one of our teams playing a local team. And the Australians, with so many players in the NBA, they really are at that level where they can compete, kind of on that global platform.
Yeah, you're not going to find many Aussie teams that aren't competitive in some way or other. You can be sure of that. Vicky, I want to come back to you on athletes and brands and the evolution therein, which is fascinating for me, because they're not just stars on the court or the pitch or the table or whatever it might be they're playing on right now. They're also content creators, they're influencers. In many cases, they're media companies in their own right. So how has this shift affected the way that your clients are connecting with fans? And again, how do you balance their commercial ambitions with the authenticity of who they are?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You're absolutely right. They are companies in their own right. They obviously are brands. I think we're all very well aware of that. But I think it genuinely comes down to authenticity and this idea of authenticity. Like those players, that particular talent, they really understand their audience. They understand their fans. They understand what those fans want from them, how they want to engage, and in that way, it's a very kind of sophisticated model, I would say, the way in which they behave and connect with their fans. That's really, really important. I think we're going to get onto data, but a lot of that as well comes through data. I also think there's been a huge shift in the power being with the fan, and what I mean by that is fans create players as well to a brilliant extent. And we've seen that a lot. I'm going to get on to talking about women's sport, but you've seen that fans really connect with these female players, be that WNBA players, be that, Ilona Myers, for example. In some cases, you could say that some of these female athletes are bigger than their sport at that time, and that's because they understand how to connect with fans and how to build a fandom, and that's so important.
We might as well, seeing as you touched on it, let's talk about that a little bit more, because if we look recent evidence, the most recent would be a Rugby World Cup in terms of women, and massive attendance there. We've seen Euros, we've seen World Cups, and we are seeing this huge engagement, but it's a different audience with a different approach. We're seeing not just women, but families attracted to these sports. That offers opportunities in itself to market in a very different way, right?
Oh, massive. Yeah, that's absolutely massive for us. So I sound like I'm plugging it now, but I feel like it's very relevant. We just today launched a new study from the Collective, which is our sort of women's empowerment platform, led by Thea, who's actually come in from the US to be here with us this week, which is super exciting. But we've just launched this research today, which is looking at the female fan, and it's looking at them from a sort of economic perspective, but also their fandom in terms of what they're engaging with. And Thea's going to talk more to that tomorrow, but you're exactly right. They engage with sport very differently. They're also more prepared to actually spend money on sponsors, on partners that they're loyal to because of these sports. So there's a huge opportunity there for brands, and you're right. They'll bring a different fandom with them. So they'll bring family along with them to watch and connect with these sports. And you absolutely saw that at the Rugby World Cup, which was amazing.
Vicky mentioned data, so Kelly, let's get into that. And also, you come back in on it as well. There's a goldmine of information out there thanks to data. And I know that some people have concerns about it as well. But how are leagues, as well as brands and athletes, using this data to further personalize that relationship with the fan?
Yeah, I think you just hit on two of the things about data that are equally scary and exciting. I think most people think of data as, I think the word you used earlier when we were coffeeing was sinister, right? What are these companies, what do they know about me? And it feels a little bit like people always know what you're doing. But the reality of data acquisition is that it allows us to really personalize and curate content and experiences for fans, right? So if we know the device you're on, or know the duration of time that you're consuming, or the time of day that you're consuming, we're able to further improve the services that we deliver to you.
And if we understand, as we mentioned right at the start, that diversity of pathways to your fandom, then that helps as well. So from your perspective, Vicky, how is data going to be such an important tool?
For us, data is everything. like really, really everything. It's so important. We work with a lot of rights holders to support them to own their own data. which is so important for us now because, actually over the last 5 years that there's been a huge shift in that actually, whereas previously a rights holder didn't need to. Anyone could own that data, the broadcasters would own that data, whereas actually now, it's imperative that they do, and it will continue to be more imperative. But for us, data is connection. Like, that's what it is. Simple as that. There's nothing sinister to it. It's like your data is everywhere anyway, but it's like, how can we better serve you? How do we know who you are? How do we know as the NBA that actually you're also going to be in Hyphen fans? That actually we should make those connections, and that our fans have, crazy enough, they have interests outside of the NBA, right? And they like sneakers. How can we bring that whole culture together to create communities within our fandom as well? And I think that's what data is. That's what the opportunity is. And if rights holders aren't embracing that, then they really are like left behind even at this point.
I think it's also a little bit about relevance. It's like when I go to NBA.com or the NBA app, I want to only see news about the Pistons, right? I don't particularly care what's happening with the Lakers. No offense to anybody.
Any other Pistons fans in the room?
You, John, I have converted you as of earlier
I'm
today.
the only other one, I think. Yeah.
But, it makes it so much more meaningful for me, right? Like, I log in, I see the information that I want to see about the team and the players. You guys are these are my colleagues. They're very much laughing at me. You see the information and the news about the players and the teams that you care about, and it makes you feel that much closer to that particular sport. There was a moment in time, 10 years ago, when I used to log into ESPN.com, and it was serving me all sorts of information and news and stats about all manner of sports. The more that you can tailor that and personalize that via the acquisition of data, the better that experience becomes for the fan, the more engagement you see, and the more time spent.
Let's talk a little bit about, we've acknowledged already that there are so many different ways of consuming and engaging with sport these days. Earlier on, you spoke about the way we consumed it back in the dark ages, which pretty much was when I was presenting television. I had a guest on stage yesterday say that he grew up watching me on the TV. Always a good way to start a panel there. But, I have my own little focus group, 2 girls who've passed through their teens into the 20s now, and I've paid a lot of attention to the way they engaged with content of various kinds, and you have your own focus group as well. But let's talk a little bit about crossovers, whether it be via TikTok, gaming crossovers. You have to accept that there's an audience that might not watch a 48-minute basketball game, or they might not watch 90 minutes of football. So with that in mind, what opportunities do you then have to embrace?
Absolutely. Bring them into the ecosystem, right? Any way that we can actually, create new fans and make sure that they are coming into our ecosystem, that can only be a fantastic thing. And again, I touch on women's sport, but that is a huge way in which women's sport has grown, right? Through women going out there and actually, or just fans of women's sport, but finding this content that wasn't necessarily readily available to them before with sort of more of your traditional broadcasters. So there's a huge opportunity there. We're talking about merch. We're talking about actually, this is who a lot of our partners, our brand partners will want to connect with, this next generation of fan, So actually, how are we then really bringing them into the ecosystem and making sure they're not just seeing our content on TikTok, but actually they become part of the broader community?
What about I suppose we have to look at the potential downsides. People might be put off by the over-commercialization. They might see content as being overly branded. They might feel that there's too much fragmentation in terms of platforms. So does that make collaboration more important for you, Kelly, in terms of ensuring that you try and stick with as many fans as you possibly can?
I think the NBA actually has an interesting sort of advantage there in that it is a brand. Basically, I used to work at Disney, and there was this sort of flywheel of touch points for the brand where it's, the movies and the theme parks and the merchandise and the princess dresses and the games and et cetera. And the NBA is very similar. There's so many different touch points.
Not so many princess dresses.
Perhaps not, but maybe, yeah, I feel like we've had some players in our day that liked a good princess dress. And also, don't forget about the W. Right? That is one of the most, I think, shining examples right now of the growth of women's sport. But yeah, I think there's so many different touch points, those, sort of like front doors to the way that people can touch the brands now. I think one of our biggest challenges with that is because of the fragmentation of everybody's attention, because of the fragmentation of platforms, and the fragmentation of just the proliferation of choice, having a brand behind all of that is authentic, that people can trust, is kind of important. And I think that speaks to, all the work that you guys are doing with different players and leagues. I mean, having that sort of relationship of trust with different brands that want to connect to that authenticity, that I think helps.
Is there a disconnect, though? I mean, I'm not between you two, but I mean, in terms of if you have the interest of a particular athlete or individual in mind, are they still that concerned about being part of a larger brand, league, or whatever, or have they got their own concerns? And therefore, does that make it easier or harder for you to make somebody attractive to fans?
That's very much a symbiotic relationship, I would say. Both parties need each other, for sure. And that's very important, and that will continue to be important. I think one of the issues that we potentially see, talking about sort of the fragmentation, is just costing fans out of sport from a content perspective. So you look at these OTT platforms, which are super important in terms of owning the data, right? That's sort of what they're there for. But we really want to make sure that actually there is accessibility to fans as well across a number of sports, that it doesn't become too elitist, that you have to be paying, for 10 different subscriptions to be able to follow all of your teams or all of the players that you focus on. So in terms of the risks that you mentioned, that is something that I do believe that the industry should be aware of, for sure.
Let's finish this up. We've got about 3 minutes. So typically what happens is we get to the last minute and suddenly I throw this horrible thing at you and say, okay, in 5 years' time when we're having this conversation, and you look at me as if to say, how can I do that in 23 seconds? So we're going to do it in 2 minutes, 42 seconds instead. But, I did an experiment recently. I canceled my fantasy Premier League team, not bothered this year. As a result, I've noticed I'm watching far fewer matches because I used to watch matches out of interest, so that was an entry for me there. We've spoken about various ways that people engage with sports. So let's look ahead over the next few years. What do you see, Kelly, being the biggest change or the biggest changes in the way that fans engage with, consume, watch, if you want to say, the sport?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges and opportunities that we have is that because fans are touching or entering into the world of the NBA in so many different ways, you really have to meet them everywhere that they are. You have to be on Instagram, you have to have a great app, you have to run, a League Pass service which delivers all of the games via OTT, you have to be on free-to-air. Pay TV business in many markets across Asia is still a strong way to connect. So you really have to meet a fan wherever they may be and have a strong offering in that category. And that challenges us, I think, to continuously innovate and create either new events and tournaments, things like Rising Stars, to sort of connect with fans directly, or whether that's investing in different technologies. So like our partnerships with Cosm, to show games in sphere atmospheres or in VR and AR.
That's so exciting. So many different ways you can engage. Pick one of those. Pick one thing that would excite you more than anything in terms of these meeting points, Vicky.
AI. I think AI is going to completely change the game for us over the next 5 years. And just thinking about kind of real-time translation into languages, for example. So we have John, he's commentating on a sport, and actually in real time, that's being translated into 200 different languages for people to actually properly connect with that sport. That's just one thing, but also I do genuinely believe this idea of gamification will hugely shift, and interactivity as well. So how we are interacting with live sport in real time, be that through betting, be that through different gamification elements. So it's going to be phenomenal, right? The shift in the next 5 years. I don't know.
Well, we've heard it is going to be phenomenal. We've heard so many ways in which leagues, sports, brands, athletes can connect authentically. And well, I just hope that we've connected authentically with all of you in the room during the course of this one. Vicky, thank you so much for sharing. Kelly, thank you so much for sharing, and hope you took something away from that. Thanks, everyone.